Welcome back. This is the second PowerPoint for the final exam review. Just as a reminder, we went through the Unit 1 Foundations Transformations. This is going to be Unit 2 Reorganizing Human Societies, going from about 600 BCE to 600 in the Common Era. And then the last one that I will update will be the Post-Classical Era from 600 to 1450. One reminder as I kind of take you through some of this review, it might be a good idea as you're working through especially the classical and post-classical, since there's so much more information, to have at your fingertips your notes or the review guides that I've put up online for you to make sure that a lot of the details that you have in your notes or on those review sheets you're kind of going over, remembering, reviewing, highlighting if you don't remember them, because these are very brief presentations just to remind you of the different eras that we studied, areas that we looked at geographically, and some of the different things that we discussed. So let's start with reorganizing human societies at 600 BCE. At the beginning, you have civilizations existing, but at this point, you don't really have large empires. You have trade starting, but again, at this point, you don't really have the existence of the Silk Road as we see it later on. You don't have a lot of the sea routes that we see later on. A lot of the civilizations are still fairly isolated. Because of that, trade is mostly regional. Women still seen as inferior. If you're looking for one of those continuities on the CCOT essay, remember I mentioned that you can always use the concept of gender stratification as a continuity because it exists across time and across geographical regions. Cultural diffusion is taking place or beginning to take place, especially when we're taking a look at Greece and Rome and the conquering of Alexander the Great during this time. This is when we see the most cultural diffusion take place. There's a small emphasis on art. We start to see more of the emphasis as we get into kind of the golden age of Greece with Pericles. By the end of this time period, you have empires that have risen and fallen. You have cultural contact within and across regions. Slavery and the status of women begin to decline. Major trade routes have developed. Now, the Silk Roads develop way back in during the Qin dynasty. However, this is when they really start to spring up and take precedence in cultural diffusion and trading across the route. Civilizations exist worldwide by the end of this time period. The one thing to note about empires rising and falling, we had the debate in class on periodization, and if you'll recall in that debate, there was some discrepancy as to whether the end of the classical age should be 500, 600, or 700, based on things like the rise of Islam that we see in the 7th century. But a lot of historians believe the end of the classical age is around 600 because by this point, most of the classical civilizations have fallen. Around 500 BCE, in ancient Persia and Iran, you have leaders like Cyrus, who expanded the Persian Empire. He was diplomatic. He had a lot of religious tolerance. However, he was followed by Darius, and Darius divided the empire into provinces. If you'll recall the Behistine inscription that we took a look at, that was carved by Darius. It was the one that basically showed him to be the greatest leader and that he would crush everyone that he came in contact with. And we looked at the bias in that particular inscription because he had to put it 3 or 4 different times that he would come across the civilization and crush it. In the next inscription, he'd come across the very same civilization and crush it. So it was obvious that he didn't defeat them thoroughly the first time. He attempted to do this to show his power when he really didn't have the power he thought he did. He believed that through Zoroastrianism he was kind of chosen by God. Remember, on the inscription itself, you have Ahura Mazda above Darius on the actual relief on the side of the mountain, showing that he's been chosen. The Sassanid Empire, which we talked a little bit about later on, won't come about until the 200s in the Common Era. That becomes kind of the more major empire that we see after the death of Alexander the Great. In Greece, you have various independent city-states or polis. It's polytheistic. There's widespread slavery, few rights for women, Remember that you have the difference between Sparta and Athens. Sparta is this militaristic culture. Children, even women, are trained in military combat from a young age. And then you have Athens, which is more based in liberal arts and philosophy. So there's a general disconnect between both of those. They fought one another in the Persian Wars between 499 and 449 BCE. And the effects of this are that Athens begin to rise as a political state. They enter this golden age under Pericles. So review Pericles' oration, which is in your textbook. I believe it has an excerpt. And then the Delian League and democracy begins to spread. And then you have the Peloponnesian War with Sparta and philosophers. If you'll recall, we took a look at the clip from 300. We talked about the actual methods that were taken by Sparta in order to conquer, and that they really they weren't used to the chokehold that we saw in the sea, and that's one reason for the defeat. Then you have Alexander the Great. Review some of his conquests. Remember that he wasn't necessarily Greek, he was Macedonian, but he ruled from the Greek city-state of Macedonia. It was a different culture altogether. His father was Philip. He ruled for 11 years and conquers a lot of the ancient world. The empire, he rules from Macedonia rather, for 11 years. The empire is divided when he dies, but Hellenistic culture spreads and blends. We start to see this through several of the capitals that are named after him, specifically Alexandria, Egypt. Hellenism kind of takes root. This is where we see a lot of the cultural diffusion throughout his empire, even down into India. You see it into Egypt and parts of Africa, spreading all the way over into the Middle East. For Rome, recalling that we talked about the three different phases of Rome, and we went through the history of Rome so quickly, it was about, I think we spent one day on the entire history of Rome. But remember that the first section that we discussed was the Republic of Rome, which goes from about 509 to 27 BCE. At this time, the Republic was made up of about 90% farmers. Women were often treated like children. They were kind of a lower status of society. They didn't take part in the Senate. The Senate was typically represented. It was the land-owning patricians, not the poor plebeians. This caused a lot of the tension, uprising. Recalling and remembering Rome, one reason why Rome became successful during the Roman Empire was the leaders were smart enough to try and entertain the poor. If you remember Breads and Circuses, when we talked about the building of the Circus Maximus, the Colosseum, remember that they believed if you gave the poor bread and circus, they'd be entertained enough to forget about all of the strife. This, of course, didn't work in the long run, but it worked in the immediate present for most of the Romans. They were polytheistic, but just like in Greece that we see in Athens, philosophy was much more important than religion at this time. They believed more in the political structure and the philosophical structure than in religion. Over time, Rome begins to expand in size. Governors were dispatched to oversee colonies. You have the Punic Wars against Carthage. The effect of this is that Rome is seen as an unchallenged power of the Mediterranean world. Part of what you'll want to review with the Punic Wars, going back, review Hannibal, some of what we talked about with Hannibal. The Republic fails because of economic inequality and a lot of upheaval. Please remember that Julius Caesar was not the first emperor of the Roman Empire. He was actually still part of the Roman Republic. When he takes control, he starts the empire phase, but the empire doesn't become so until his son, Octavian Caesar Augustus, who's considered the greatest emperor. The empire goes from about 27, and the year of the fall is anywhere from 474 to 476. We've talked about it in class being 476, so that's the date I'd like you to remember. It expands into the size that it included during most of the empire, which includes about 80 million people. And during this time period, you have the Pax Romana as well, which is that time of peace. Even though, remember, many of the emperors that we talked about, going from anyone like Nero to some of the other crazy emperors that took place, you have a lot of disaster within the ruling class because there's no true succession to the throne. There's only one time period in the Roman Empire history that you have the time of five great emperors that actually make improvements to the Roman Empire, but more than that, you have a lot of disaster taking place, which leads to a slow decline of the empire. Generally, the emperors were not from the same family. Again, that problem of succession that we see. Slavery and women's status and social inequalities still remain. Then you see the rise of Christianity. At the first, there's persecution, but then you have the general acceptance, and in 312 by Constantine, when he converts to Christianity, this leads to the moving of the capital from Rome to Byzantium in 324. This is really the major part of the decline for the Roman Empire. Um, Remember that some historians claim the Roman Empire doesn't really end until 1917 with the Russian Revolution. And we talked about the idea that when Byzantium becomes Constantinople during the reign of Justinian, that really continues the Roman Empire. However, let's consider this. The western part of the Roman Empire falls in 476, and it all starts with the moving of the capital to Byzantium in 324. So in 400s, Rome is falling. You have invasions, you have political corruption, you have economic troubles. One of the biggest invasions that take place at this time and that hurt Rome is the invasion of the Huns. This moves us to China, and I'll show you a slide in a minute to compare again the fall of the Han Dynasty with the fall of the Roman Empire. There's many similarities to this. But to start, before you get to Han, we have the Qin Dynasty, which is a very short-lived dynasty. It's 221 to 206 BCE. This is considered the first Chinese empire. This is the one that was ruled by legalist tactics. It was Shi Huangdi. Just in case you don't remember his name, I do want to spell his name for you here. So 1 second. Let me get to this. And then remember that it's Shi Huangdi, who's the one and only emperor. His son takes over briefly after his death. However, it doesn't last very long. But Shi Huangdi was a legalist emperor, and once he dies in 207, his son takes over for a year, and then in 206, Emperor Wu begins to consolidate the Qin, and he creates the Han Dynasty out of ideas of the Qin. He takes some of the legalist tactics from the Qin Dynasty and kind of merges them into what would become known as kind of the Confucian rule of the Han Dynasty. You have social inequality at this time. You have the elites wearing silk. Commoners lived in crowded areas. Farming was important, and remember that farming was really, again, about 85% of the citizens of China at this time. You have canals being built. The starting of the Great Wall had been started prior to this during the Qin Dynasty. It was finished. The final Great Wall of China that we know today was not finished and built and redone until the Ming Dynasty, which is many, many years later. We'll talk about the Ming when we get to the early modern era. But they also invented paper, they produced steel. The Silk Roads are established and become an important trading route. Remember that during this time, throughout all of the classical era into the post-classical era, Europe and China never come in contact with one another. The middleman, which ends up being the Mongols for a great portion of the Silk Road's time period in post-classical era, they control the trade on the Silk Road. They become the middlemen, and they want to control that trade for the money, so that you don't see a lot of contact between Europe and China really until Marco Polo in 1271. The decline is due to invasions, political corruption, and economic troubles. Some similarities between Rome and Han. You have patriarchal society, agriculture being important, water engineering. One of the best feats that you see in Rome are the Roman aqueducts. Networks of roads for trading. Remember that the Roman roads that were stone, they were just as important to trading as the Silk Road was to Han China. And they decline based on similar causes, and they also end up moving their capital. Some of the differences. You don't have spiritual connection for Roman rulers. Again, religion isn't as important as it is in China in terms of the cult of ancestry. Confucianism was seen as a model, whereas Christianity, especially for Constantine, was at first a problem, and then it kind of moves into emphasizing laws. It's not necessarily seen as this model for living or a model for a moral life. In India, the last PowerPoint we talked briefly about the Vedic age. Remember that the Vedic age starts with the Aryans. They bring the caste system, some of the Vedic literature from this time, the Rig Veda, kind of the holy scripture and the holy text, which turns into several of the other works that we read and talked about. You also have a rise of Buddhism and Hinduism. The Mauryan Empire, which is from 324 to 184 BCE, was started by Chandragupta I. And in this time, you have harsh rulers, heavy taxes, but his grandson Ashoka, who was a Buddhist convert, actually becomes a more tolerant ruler. He's the one that builds stupas all throughout India, many of which will have kind of these laws and moral sayings on them based in Buddhism. India then enters a period of 500 years of chaos and disunity. And a lot of this takes place during the Gupta Empire, which is started by Chandragupta, not to be confused with Chandragupta I that starts Mauryan. This is another one. He starts the Gupta Empire in the 320s. They exploit agriculture. They're smaller in size than the Mauryan. The governors are organized in outlying areas. They're mostly Hindu. In fact, there's a point where you have some rulers that actually ban the practice of Buddhism. And there's the extremely low status of women, and this is evidenced by the sati. The sati, if you'll recall, is the practice of women throwing themselves on their husband's funeral pyre to commit suicide, or they commit suicide in other ways after the death of their husband because they have no more reason for going on. This is since outlawed, but it was a practice that took place for much of the post-classical period in India. Their declines caused by invasions and economic and political troubles. So as the 600 year approaches, or the year 600, and again, we have the debate on what the most appropriate time would be to call an end to the classical period. 600 is the most common for historians. As the year 600 approaches, you have trade and cultural contacts increasing. They intensify in the Old World. You have the Silk Roads. You have the Indian Trade Network, the Indian Ocean Trade Network, which stretches from Arabia to India and down to Southeast Asia. This is when you see the spread of religion, especially Buddhism, and you see the spread of spices. We'll talk a lot more about the spice, sugar, and salt trade when we get to the early modern period. Then you have the Sahara trade routes from Mediterranean to areas just below the Sahara Desert. This was made or strengthened rather by the use of camels. Remember that camels are considered the ships of the sand, and camels are really what make the Saharan trade routes possible. It helps grow Africa into a very important trade partner for most of the world, especially during the post-classical. In sub-Saharan Africa, you still see a lot of isolation taking place. We talked about Northern Africa, especially Axum in Egypt, becoming Christian, the creation of the Coptic Christians in Egypt. Christianity moves down to Axum, but still at this time you have some isolation taking place. The Bantu migrations that start in the 100s in the Common Era last for about 1,000 years. It really becomes important with the spread of Islam. When Islam takes hold of parts of Africa, especially the eastern and western coast, you begin to see many more migrations taking place down to the southern tip of Africa at this time. And this is when they're beginning to bring iron-making technology, new languages, and cultures south. Remember, and we'll talk about this in post-classical review, but in Africa, Swahili is a mixture because of the spread of Islam. And again, we'll review that in post-classical. So just to end with a map, this shows some of the most important routes. You have the land routes, especially the Silk Road, which is located right here. The Silk Road splits, and as it splits, you have a lot of Buddhist monasteries that are built during the classical period along the route. Then you have kind of the middle area of the trade route for the Silk Road that is controlled especially by the Mongols, and that cuts off most of Europe from having direct contact with China. They only have contact through the Silk Road trade route. And then you have the sea routes, the Indian Ocean sea route, which comes up here into, around India and comes up through Africa, hits the Mediterranean. And Rome controls the Mediterranean trade route through most of the period of the classical era. This, of course, changes once Constantinople becomes a major power player, especially in post-classical with Justinian. That becomes kind of the centralized location for trade, and we'll talk about that when we get to the review of post-classical. So that brings to an end Unit 2. Again, review the guides that I have online, go back and review your notes and watch some of the other videos that we have. And I will put up the Unit 3 review momentarily.